So if you're a Christian listening to this and you realize now that the Trinity is false, it's defunct, it's a rationally incoherent doctrine, and you want the pure monotheism, the one God to worship without this complication, this Father, Son, or Holy Spirit, incarnation, this, that, the other, then it's Islam that you have to start looking into with sincerity. If you are sincere, the whole problem is solved.
Islam is often presented as the world's simplest and most rational religion. Its defenders, like Muhammad Hijab, love to invite Christians and others to abandon their so-called contradictory beliefs and embrace Islam's supposed clarity. But what if I told you there's a dark secret lurking beneath these claims of simplicity? A secret so unsettling, so deeply buried, that Muslim apologists like Hijab will never bring it up. Buried deep in Islamic history and even within the Quran itself is a mysterious story, a story of three pagan deities, a prophet, and a shocking revelation that was once part of Orthodox Islam but has since been swept under the rug. What is this story and why is it so dangerous to Islam's credibility? Let's start with a couple verses from the Quran, verses that mention three pagan deities. At first glance, they may seem harmless, even obscure, but as we'll see, they hide a secret that the earliest Muslims knew all too well. A secret that became so embarrassing, it was erased from Orthodox Islam as we know it. Surah 53:19. Have you considered Al-Lat and Al-Uzza and Manat, the third one, the other? These two short verses may not look like much at first glance, but they are some of the most puzzling in the entire Quran. They name three pagan deities, Lat, Uzza, and Manat, worshipped by the Quraysh tribe in pre-Islamic Arabia. Why would the Quran, a book that repeatedly condemns idol worship, mention these gods in such an ambiguous way? And what's even stranger, after the Quran mentions these three pagan deities, Lat, Uzza, and Manat, you might expect an immediate and forceful condemnation, declaring them to be false gods. After all, Islam is supposed to be the purest form of monotheism, but that's not what happens. Instead, the very next verse shifts focus entirely. Is the male for you, and for him the female? This verse criticizes the Quraysh for attributing female names to angels, a seemingly unrelated point that feels sort of out of step with the gravity of the preceding verses. Why doesn't the Quran denounce these gods outright? Why this sudden pivot to an issue about angels? It's a strange detour that raises even more questions about the meaning of Lat, Uzza, and Manat in this passage, and why these names were invoked at all. Now we do know this. These verses were delivered during a critical moment in Muhammad's life. He faced growing opposition from his tribe, the Quraysh, who fiercely defended their ancestral gods. The stakes were high, and Muhammad's mission was hanging in the balance. But what happened next is one of the most controversial moments in Islamic history. Something so significant, it would later be rewritten, reinterpreted, and eventually suppressed. To uncover the truth, we need to go back to some of the earliest Islamic sources. The year is 615 AD, and Mecca is at a crossroads. Muhammad's mission is in jeopardy. His message of monotheism has alienated the Quraysh, the dominant tribe that clings fiercely to their ancient gods, Lat, Uzza, and Manat. These three goddesses are the cornerstone of their worship and identity. For years, Muhammad's denunciation of their gods has only intensified the hostility. His followers are few, his influence is fragile, the pressure to compromise is mounting. And then something extraordinary happens. The early Islamic sources, Ibn Ishaq, Tabari, and Ibn Sa'id, describe a pivotal public recitation of Surah 53, the Star. The Quraysh gather, skeptical but curious, to hear Muhammad speak. His voice resonates through the crowd. Have you considered Lat and Uzza and Manat, the third, the other? The Quraysh brace for what comes next, another condemnation of their gods? Instead, Muhammad continues with words that leave them stunned. These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for. For the first time, Muhammad's words appear to affirm the power and status of the Quraysh's deities. The tension in the air evaporates. According to these sources, the Quraysh are so moved by this acknowledgement that they prostrate alongside Muhammad. For a brief moment, the bitter divide between them seems to heal. Peace, it seems, is finally within reach. But this triumph is short-lived. Days later, Muhammad shocked his followers and the Quraysh by retracting the verses, claiming that they had not come from Allah, but from Satan. According to Ibn Ishaq, Jibril, known in Islamic tradition as the angel Gabriel, who delivers divine revelations, confronted Muhammad, exposing the deception. Quote, Jibril came to the messenger and said, Muhammad, what have you done? You have recited to the people that which I did not bring to you from God, and you have said that which he did not say to you. Muhammad was absolutely devastated, but he claimed God provided reassurance through another revelation. Quote, we have not sent before you a messenger or a prophet, but that when he desired, Satan cast something into his desire. Then God removes that which Satan casts and establishes his signs clearly. This new revelation amounts to a startling admission. Muhammad himself acknowledged that Satan had successfully influenced his words. The phrase, Satan cast something into his desire, explicitly confirms that Satan exploited Muhammad's internal thoughts and wishes, his longing to reconcile with his tribe, the Quraysh, to infiltrate what he believed to be divine revelation. Moreover, the verse suggests that this wasn't unique to Muhammad, but had occurred with previous prophets as well. While framed as a reassurance, it inadvertently raises a very troubling question. If Satan could deceive Muhammad once, how could his followers be certain it hadn't happened on other occasions? The fallout was immediate. The Quraysh, who had been thrilled by Muhammad's apparent affirmation of their gods, now felt betrayed, and their hostility toward him intensified. Here is our question. Why would devout Muslim historians record this incident? Why include a story so embarrassing, one that casts Muhammad as fallible, even deceived? To answer this, we turn to the groundbreaking work of Shaykh Ahmed, a highly respected Muslim scholar whose credentials are impeccable. Ahmed, who taught at Harvard University, dedicated his life to the study of Islamic history and theology. His book, Before Orthodoxy, published by the prestigious Harvard University Press, meticulously examines over 50 early Islamic sources that document the Satanic Verses incident. These aren't accounts written by Islam's critics. They're drawn from within the tradition itself. Again, if this story is false, why would the earliest Muslims invent it? Fabricating such an event would mean creating a narrative that severely undermines Muhammad's credibility, essentially sabotaging their own cause. This is why Ahmed's work is so important. His research highlights a historical principle that's difficult to ignore, the principle of embarrassment. Historians recognize that the more damaging a story is to its subject, the more likely it is to be true. In this story, it's about as damaging as it gets. No Muslim would invent a tale that undermines their own prophet's credibility unless they're grappling with events that actually happened. Today, if you ask a Muslim scholar about the Satanic Verses, you'll likely be met with a swift and unequivocal denial. Across every major sect, Sunni, Shia, Salafi, Wahhabi, the story isn't just rejected, it's condemned. Believing it could even cost someone their status as a Muslim. Because admitting that the Prophet of Islam could mistakenly recite words inspired by Satan doesn't just raise a few eyebrows, it threatens to unravel the very foundation of Islam itself. But what's fascinating is that this wasn't always the case. According to Shaykh Ahmed, in Before Orthodoxy, the rejection of the Satanic Verses incident is a modern phenomenon. He writes this, quote, the fundamental finding of this present volume is that in the first 2 centuries of Islam, Muslim attitudes to the Satanic Verses incident were effectively the direct opposite of what they are today. This volume studies no less than 50 historical reports that narrate the Satanic Verses incident and that were transmitted by the first generations of Muslims. This study of the Satanic Verses incident in the historical memory of the early Muslim community will demonstrate in detail that the incident constituted an absolute standard element in the memory of early Muslims of the life of their prophet. In other words, for the first 200 years of Islam, this incident wasn't just accepted, it was universally recognized by the earliest Muslims as part of Muhammad's life story. It wasn't until centuries later, as Islam expanded and sought to solidify its claims to perfection, that the story became a theological liability. By the Abbasid era, Muslim leaders and scholars began rewriting history, dismissing the Satanic Verses as a fabrication by Islam's enemies.
Okay, so we get the gist of what Capturing Christianity is saying. He's talking about the Satanic Verses story, which is recorded in Ibn Ishaq, the History of al-Tabari, and Ibn Sa'd, Kitab al-Kabir. So the question really, so these are early biography sources of the Prophet Muhammad. So the question really arises, is the Satanic Verses story true and reliable according to even early Muslim scholars? And if it's not reliable, why was it recorded in the first place? So let's begin here. The story is found in Ibn Ishaq, pages 165 to 167, in the History of Al-Tabari, volume 6, pages 107 to 113, in Ibn Sa'd, volume 1, pages 236 to 239. However, so these are the sources where it's found. It's found in Ibn Ishaq, the History of Al-Tabari, and Ibn Sa'd, Kitab al-Kabir. So the question really now we've seen the sources where the Satanic Verses story is recorded. However, none of these sources have fully connected chains of transmission for the story, or fully reliable chains of transmission or narrators for the story. Hell, even Ibn Ishaq said that the Satanic story, even Ibn Ishaq said that the Satanic Verses story is false, which I'll be getting into right now. Even Ibn Ishaq said that the Satanic Verses story is forgery and false. Abu Hayyan al-Andulasi mentions about this story. Imam Muhammad bin Ishaq, which is Ibn Ishaq, the compiler of sirah — sirah means biography of the Prophet Muhammad — was asked about the Satanic Verses, and he said this is from the fabrication of the heretics, and he wrote a book about the issue. So even Ibn Ishaq wrote an entire book about how the Satanic Verses story is false, according to al-Bahr, al-Muhit, fi Tafsir, volume 7, page 526. The reference is on the screen there. So even Ibn Ishaq said that the story is false. So even the earliest biographer of the Prophet Muhammad said that the Satanic Verses story is false. So it can't be used as some kind of evidence against the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, so we move on to the next source. What is the next source that records the Satanic Verses story? It's Al-Tabari. Al-Tabari himself stated in very plainly that all the narrations in his work are not authentic. In the beginning of his history book, called the History of Al-Tabari, or the History of Al-Rasul wal-Malik, means the history of the prophets and kings. So basically, the History of Al-Tabari, Volume 1, if you read the preface, it says that Al-Tabari warns people that his books are filled with weak and authentic narrations. In the History of Al-Tabari, Volume 1, pages 170 to 171, the English version. So we could see that Al-Tabari recorded a lot of false stories about the Prophet Muhammad. So even he's warning that that his stories are not fully authentic. So we see that in the History of Al-Tabari, Volume 1, page 170 to 171, this means that Al-Tabari warns people that his books are filled with weak and false stories about the Prophet Muhammad, and it's up to the reader to do proper research to figure out which stories are true or not. In this case, the story is not reliable or authentic because of the chain of transmission. Ibn Ishaq is one of the narrators of the Satanic Verses story found in the History of Al-Tabari, whose authenticity, the much debated story Satanic Verses is narrated. So we see the chain of transmission. The narrator is Ibn Ishaq, and as we've seen, that Ibn Ishaq, the earliest biographer of the Prophet Muhammad, said the Satanic Verses story is false. I gave that reference in the previous slide. This means the story is false in the history of Al-Tabari because one of the narrators was Ibn Ishaq and there are other unreliable narrators. The next source is Ibn Sa'd, Volume 1, pages 236 to 239. But the problem with Ibn Sa'd is that he has Waqidi as one of the narrators of the hadith of the Satanic Verses. However, Waqidi was a known liar and a fabricator of hadith. So al-Waqidi was one of the narrators in Ibn Sa'd's book, in Ibn Sa'd's history book, that narrated the Satanic Verses story. So the question really arises: is Waqidi what is al-Waqidi? What is his reputation? Al-Waqidi was a known liar and a fabricator of hadith, which I will be getting into right now. There are a bunch of Muslim scholars who said that al-Waqidi is a liar and a fabricator of stories. Al-Waqidi, the narrator of the Satanic Verses story, he was a known liar and fabricator of hadith and stories of the Prophet Muhammad. Imam Shafi said all the books of al-Waqidi are lies. The reference is right there. Ahmad ibn Hanbal said that al-Waqidi is a liar, makes alterations in the traditions, and the reference is right there. So these classical and early Muslim scholars have said that al-Waqidi books are lies, and al-Waqidi is a liar, and he tells false stories or false traditions. He makes up stories, basically, about the Prophet Muhammad, and he passes it on. And Ibn Sa'd wrote that a false story of the Prophet Muhammad from al-Waqidi, who is a unreliable or a known liar in hadith methodology. Thus, the story, as found in Ibn Sa'd, because it contains Waqidi as a narrator who we know is a known liar and a fabricator of hadith, according to Muslim scholars who studied the source. So the story is false as found in Ibn Sa'd because it contains Waqidi, who is a known liar and a fabricator of hadith. So since al-Waqidi is the one narrating the Satanic Verses story, in Ibn Sa'd, that automatically means the story is false because al-Waqidi is a known liar and a fabricator of hadith, and he's passing on lies, or he's passing on made up stories about the Prophet Muhammad, and Ibn Sa'd wrote that story. So the story is automatically false because it has a liar or a fabricator of hadith in the chain of transmission. Just because a story in the New Testament or Islamic history sources is early and recorded doesn't mean the story is reliable or true. There is early truth and early falsehood and lies recorded in both the Bible and the sources of the life of the Prophet Muhammad. So just because something is early doesn't mean it's reliable. And just because a story is found in the New Testament or Ibn Ishaq or the history of Al-Tabari, that doesn't mean it's reliable because there's early truth and there's early falsehood. Because people would make up these stories. The criteria of embarrassment doesn't work because people would make up these stories about the Prophet Muhammad, about Jesus, after their times for political reasons, sectarian reasons, you name it. So the criteria of embarrassment doesn't work to prove the story. As for Sahab Ahmad, that Harvard professor, who gives a shit what he's saying? Who gives a shit about what Sahab Ahmad says? Like, who gives a shit? Who gives a damn? It's not about my scholar said this, etc. Sahab Ahmad can kiss my ass because he has absolutely no evidence that the story is reliable and that the narrators of the story are reliable narrators, and provides no authentic or reliable chain of transmission of narrators of the story, that go. So he doesn't prove that the story goes back to reliable narrators. So his opinion of the story is worthless and can't be taken seriously. This Western methodology of looking at early sources and concluding that those sources have reliable information is false because they don't know how to weed out or how to properly do methodology to verify a report. Verify whether a report is reliable or not, looking at the chain of transmission or the sources of the story. So Sahab Ahmad's opinion means absolutely nothing. It's worthless because he doesn't provide evidence. provide evidence to show that the story is true. Even classical Muslim scholars like Ibn Kathir, Sawkani, Ibn Zawai, Ibn Qayyum Bakani said that the Satanic Verses story is false, and there's the references right there. So classical Muslim scholars and early Muslim scholars have all agreed that the story is false. So even Ibn Ishaq said the story is false, but he still narrated anyways, just to put anything, just to fill his books with whatever information he could find about the Prophet Muhammad. Doesn't mean all the stories or all the sayings in his book are reliable or true. So the conclusion we can draw here is that the Satanic Verses story is false and not an authentic story about the Prophet Muhammad. Even early Muslim scholars like Ibn Ishaq and Tabari say that the story was false and a fabrication, but they recorded it anyways because they wanted to include any story in their books without fact-checking the stories. They were writing anything without doing. They were recording anything without fact-checking the stories or the sources, whether the sources were reliable narrators or known liars. So they were recording anything they heard from anybody. So the criteria of embarrassment doesn't work because, of course, people will make up non-flattering stories about the Prophet Muhammad after he died for political reasons, sectarian reasons, theological reasons, you name it. The criteria of embarrassment doesn't work because, people, of course, people will make up these non-flattering stories for sectarian reasons, political reasons, whatever reason they would make up those unflattering stories about the Prophet Muhammad. The story is false according to Muslim scholars and can't be taken. My point is the story is false according to Muslim scholars and can't be taken as evidence against the Prophet Muhammad or to show the Prophet Muhammad allowed paganism or polytheism. So the story is false. Capturing Christianity is wrong. The story needs to be rejected and can be thrown in the garbage cans.